Harold Thompson stood by the entrance of his restaurant, La Mona Elegante, observing the evening's guests as they filtered into the dining room. The soft glow of chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, while the gentle clink of silverware and the murmur of low conversation filled the air. It was everything Harold had built over the years: luxury, exclusivity, refinement, and it ran like a well-oiled machine under his control. Harold, a man in his early 60s with neatly combed silver hair and a crisp-tailored suit, exuded an air of quiet authority. To the outside world, La Mona Elegante was a beacon of fine dining, an establishment that had long catered to the city's wealthiest and most elite. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was Harold's legacy, a testament to his taste and meticulous attention to detail. For him, this place symbolized years of hard work, discipline, and an unspoken understanding of who belonged and who didn't. Though Harold had never voiced his views explicitly, those close to him knew there was more to his careful curation than just maintaining quality. He valued a certain kind of guest, a particular demographic that he believed embodied the refinement of his establishment. He prided himself on keeping an air of exclusivity, ensuring that La Mona Elegante remained a place for people like him. Those who didn't quite fit in often found themselves subtly but unmistakably discouraged from returning. Tonight, as he surveyed the room, everything appeared to be in order. Wealthy patrons dined at their usual tables, draped in designer attire, speaking in hushed tones. It was the kind of crowd Harold had carefully cultivated over the years. Polished, elegant, predictable, just the way he liked it. As Harold turned back toward the entrance, he noticed a couple approaching. Even from a distance, they appeared well-dressed. The man wore a tailored suit, and the woman's red dress flowed elegantly as she walked beside him. At first glance, they fit the image Harold had cultivated for his restaurant. Affluent, sophisticated. But as they drew closer, Harold's smile faltered slightly. The couple, Marcus and Olivia Daniels, were black. Though Harold's expression remained polite, a subtle shift occurred in his demeanor. His mind, trained over years of carefully vetting his clientele, immediately questioned their presence. It wasn't that Harold had openly discriminatory views, at least not in his eyes. It was simply that people like Marcus and Olivia didn't typically frequent places like La Mona Elegante. Harold had long cultivated an unspoken rule of who belonged, and this couple didn't align with that image. His world operated on appearances, and appearances, Harold believed, told him all he needed to know. Still, he approached them with his usual polished smile, masking his internal hesitation. "Good evening," he said smoothly. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" Marcus returned the smile, his expression composed. "Yes, we do. It's under Daniels." Harold gave a brief nod, and without looking at the maitre d', signaled for the reservation to be checked. A flicker of surprise crossed Harold's face when the maitre d' confirmed the reservation without issue. For a moment, Harold considered if there had been a mistake. How had they gotten past the invisible gate he so meticulously maintained? "Right this way," Harold said, his tone polite but with an edge that hinted at his disapproval. As Harold led them through the restaurant, his mind raced. In his world, things followed a predictable order. Certain people fit, and others didn't. And despite their attire, despite their calm confidence, Marcus and Olivia disrupted that order. He seated them at a table near the back, one close to the kitchen, a spot he usually reserved for guests he deemed less important. It was a subtle gesture, one that spoke volumes to anyone familiar with the restaurant's unspoken rules. But Marcus and Olivia didn't react. They simply took their seats with grace, as if they hadn't noticed, or didn't care. For Harold, that was unsettling. He watched them for a moment longer, expecting some sign of discomfort, some indication that they knew they were out of place. But there was none. Marcus smiled warmly at Olivia as they settled in, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they had been seated in the least desirable spot in the room. Harold's unease deepened. He had built his entire career on control, on knowing who belonged in his world and who didn't. But for the first time, as he returned to his station at the entrance, Harold felt something slipping out of his grasp. As Harold returned to his post by the entrance, his mind still lingered on Marcus and Olivia. They weren't behaving the way he expected guests like them to act. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty in their movements. In fact, they looked as though they belonged there, among his carefully curated crowd. Their composure made Harold uneasy. From his vantage point, Harold kept an eye on the couple, trying to decipher what it was about them that bothered him so much. They sat with an ease that unnerved him, their conversation quiet and relaxed. Olivia's smile was warm as she spoke to Marcus, her laughter soft and genuine. It was a calm confidence that Harold wasn't used to seeing in people who didn't fit into the world he had built. Around the room, Harold noticed the subtle glances from his regular patrons. The diners, dressed in their usual designer suits and dresses, took quick, discreet looks at Marcus and Olivia. The gazes weren't openly hostile, but Harold could feel the quiet disapproval beneath the surface, just as he had when they had walked in. The question lingered in the air, though no one would dare ask it out loud. What are they doing here? And yet, Marcus and Olivia remained unfazed. Their conversation continued uninterrupted, the glances of the other patrons either unnoticed or ignored. The more Harold watched them, the more he realized that they weren't reacting the way he had expected. Most guests who found themselves seated in that less than desirable spot would at least show some sign of discomfort. A glance around the room, a hesitant look at the waiter. But not them. The maitre d', sensing Harold's tension, approached quietly. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. Harold didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on Marcus and Olivia. He had spent years cultivating an atmosphere of exclusivity in this restaurant, ensuring that every guest fit into the image he had so carefully crafted. And now, this couple, this black couple, was sitting in his restaurant, acting as though they belonged just as much as anyone else. Harold forced himself to look away, turning back to the maitre d'. "Keep an eye on them," he said in a hushed tone. "Make sure their service is handled carefully." The maitre d' nodded, his face betraying no emotion as he returned to his duties. Harold knew that his instructions were clear enough. The couple would be treated well, just well enough, but nothing more. They wouldn't be given the same level of service his other patrons received. Not overtly, but in subtle ways that only an experienced restaurateur like Harold would notice. As the night wore on, Harold's discomfort deepened. No matter how much he tried to focus on other guests, his gaze kept drifting back to Marcus and Olivia. They ordered drinks and appetizers, their conversation still easy and light, as though the rest of the world barely existed around them. But for Harold, they were becoming an unwanted focal point, disrupting the controlled environment he had built. He watched as their appetizers arrived later than those of the tables nearby. Marcus glanced briefly at the plates, but said nothing. Instead, he simply continued his conversation with Olivia, completely unbothered by the delay. Harold had expected at least a flicker of annoyance, some sign that they knew they were being treated differently. But there was nothing. This only frustrated Harold further. He had orchestrated subtle slights like this many times before, and usually they worked as intended. Guests who didn't quite fit would grow uncomfortable, realize they weren't welcome, and wouldn't return. It was a system Harold had perfected, one that allowed him to maintain the exclusivity of his establishment without ever saying a word. But tonight, his system was failing. Harold clenched his jaw as he noticed Olivia smiling again, this time at a joke Marcus had made. They were enjoying themselves. Despite the delay, despite the glances from other diners, despite the subtle message Harold had sent by seating them near the kitchen, they were still enjoying themselves. For a man like Harold, whose entire world was built on control, that was an unsettling thought. Harold's irritation simmered beneath the surface as he continued to observe Marcus and Olivia. Every passing moment deepened his sense of unease. He had tried the subtle tricks, the quiet signals meant to remind them they didn't belong, but nothing seemed to faze them. They were calm, composed, and worst of all, confident. He wasn't used to being ignored like this, especially not by people who clearly didn't fit into the image of his restaurant. They should have felt uncomfortable by now. They should have realized they were out of place. And yet, here they were, enjoying their meal, as though they were in perfect harmony with their surroundings. Harold's frustration mounted. He knew he had to do something more direct, something that would send a clearer message. He straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and made his way across the dining room, weaving through the elegant tables and perfectly polished silverware. His expression was perfectly composed, his smile practiced, but inside, his irritation churned. As he approached Marcus and Olivia's table, they looked up, their expressions open and polite. Marcus offered a small nod of acknowledgement, while Olivia smiled graciously. They showed no sign of discomfort or unease, and that only fueled Harold's frustration further. "Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Daniels," Harold greeted them smoothly. "I trust you're enjoying your evening?" Olivia looked at him with the same warm smile she had worn since they arrived. "Yes, thank you," she replied. "Everything has been lovely." Harold's smile tightened ever so slightly, though he maintained his veneer of professionalism. "Good, good," he said, his tone slightly clipped. "I just wanted to check in personally. You see, we take great pride in ensuring that our guests have a flawless experience here at Limone Elegante." His words carried an unspoken edge, a reminder of the restaurant's exclusivity, of the fact that he was in control here. But Marcus and Olivia didn't flinch. "We appreciate that," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. "We've had no complaints so far." Harold stood there for a moment, searching their faces for any sign of irritation, any hint that they had noticed the subtle slights in their service. But there was nothing. They were as composed and unbothered as ever. Harold leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just a fraction. "I couldn't help but notice that your reservation was a bit unusual," he said, his tone polite but layered with suggestion. "We don't often receive bookings from guests who aren't already familiar with our establishment." Marcus and Olivia exchanged a brief glance, one that Harold couldn't quite read. But before he could say more, Marcus spoke up, his voice calm and measured. "Well, we heard great things about Limone Elegante," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. "It seemed like the perfect place to celebrate a special occasion." Harold raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A special occasion?" he asked, though the question felt like a formality. "Yes," Marcus replied with a small smile. "Our wedding anniversary." The words caught Harold off guard for a moment, though he quickly recovered. He hadn't anticipated that. The realization that they were here for such a personal, meaningful event added a new layer of complexity to his growing frustration. How could he continue pushing them away without seeming overtly rude? "Well," Harold said, forcing his smile back into place, "I'm glad you chose us to celebrate such an important occasion." Olivia nodded graciously, her demeanor as poised as ever. "Thank you. We've been enjoying it very much." Harold lingered for a moment longer, unsure of what else to say. His usual tactics weren't working. The subtle provocations, the veiled comments, none of it seemed to land. Marcus and Olivia remained perfectly composed, their confidence unwavering. "Please let us know if there's anything you need," Harold said finally, straightening up and preparing to make his exit. "Of course," Marcus replied, his smile still in place. "Thank you." As Harold turned to leave, a bitter thought gnawed at him. No matter what he did, they weren't going to give him the reaction he wanted, and that infuriated him. Harold returned to his post near the entrance, but his mind remained firmly on Marcus and Olivia. His frustration had only deepened after their brief conversation. Their calm, polite responses had given him nothing to work with. He had tried to unsettle them with subtle provocations, but they hadn't so much as blinked. For someone like Harold, who thrived on control, their refusal to show discomfort felt like a challenge, a silent defiance that grated on him. His world was one of unspoken rules and hierarchies, and in his mind, Marcus and Olivia had no place in it. The evening wore on, and Harold's irritation only grew. Each time he glanced in their direction, he saw the same thing: Marcus and Olivia enjoying their meal without a care in the world. Despite the delayed service and the less-than-ideal table placement, they remained completely at ease. Harold's frustration simmered just beneath the surface, each minute that passed feeding into his sense of losing control over his own establishment. Finally, he could no longer stand it. He approached the maître d', who had been quietly overseeing the service for the evening. The maître d'ici was a man Harold trusted implicitly, someone who understood the unspoken code of Limone Elegante as well as he did. "Make sure their service continues to be delayed," Harold whispered, his voice low and controlled. "No rush with their next course." The maître d' hesitated for just a moment, his eyes flicking toward Marcus and Olivia's table before quickly returning to Harold. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but Harold could sense the discomfort in his staff member. Still, the maître d' did as he was told without question. Harold had that kind of power over his employees, power built on years of unchallenged authority. Harold felt a grim sense of satisfaction as he watched the maître d' discreetly instruct the kitchen to slow down Marcus and Olivia's orders. If they wouldn't take the hint, Harold would push them further. Surely at some point they would realize they weren't welcome. At some point their calm composure would crack. But the minutes passed and nothing changed. Marcus and Olivia continued their conversation, laughing together quietly as if the delay was of no consequence. Their food arrived late, but they showed no signs of impatience or annoyance. In fact, they appeared to be enjoying their evening more with each passing minute. Harold felt his frustration reaching its peak. How could they be so unaffected by everything he was doing? His methods had worked countless times before. Guests who didn't fit his image of Limone Elegante usually picked up on the subtle cues and left feeling unwelcome. They rarely returned. But Marcus and Olivia were different. They were showing no sign of discomfort, no indication that they were bothered by the treatment they were receiving. Instead, they seemed entirely in control of the situation, as if they knew exactly what Harold was trying to do and were refusing to give him the satisfaction of reacting. As he stood by the entrance, Harold found himself replaying the moments in his head, trying to understand what it was about this couple that unsettled him so much. It wasn't just their race, though he couldn't deny that it played a part in his discomfort. It was their confidence, their refusal to be pushed aside or made to feel out of place. They were sitting at a table meant to diminish their experience, enduring service that was designed to frustrate them, and yet they acted as though none of it mattered. It was as though they were impervious to the subtle slights that had always worked before. Harold's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium where he stood. He had never lost control like this. Never. But tonight his well-constructed world was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't stand it. The maître d' returned to Harold's side, his face a mask of neutrality. "The orders have been slowed, sir," he said quietly, "but they don't seem to mind." Harold's jaw clenched. "Thank you," he said, his voice strained. As the maître d' moved away, Harold's eyes locked on Marcus and Olivia once more. His usual tactics weren't working, and for the first time in years, Harold found himself uncertain about what to do next. He had built this restaurant to reflect his vision of exclusivity, of who belonged and who didn't. And yet, tonight, it felt as though all of that was unraveling before his eyes. Marcus and Olivia weren't just guests at his restaurant. They were a challenge to everything Harold believed in, and it was a challenge he wasn't sure how to meet. As the evening wore on, Harold's irritation deepened, along with a growing sense of helplessness. No matter what tactics he employed, Marcus and Olivia remained poised, enjoying their night as if nothing was wrong. It wasn't just that they ignored the slights, it was that they didn't even seem to notice them. Harold wasn't used to being defied in his own establishment. He had built Limone Elegante to be a fortress of exclusivity, a place where only certain kinds of people felt at home. His subtle tactics, the unspoken rules of his restaurant, had always been enough to keep out those who didn't belong. But tonight, they had failed him. Unable to bear it any longer, Harold made a decision, one that he knew would cross a line but felt necessary. His pride wouldn't allow him to let this go. Taking a deep breath, he walked across the dining room once more, this time with more purpose. He approached Marcus and Olivia's table, his face set in a polite but firm expression. Marcus looked up as Harold reached them, and Olivia followed suit, her expression calm. Harold forced a smile, though it felt tight and unnatural. "Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Daniels," he began smoothly, though the tension in his voice was evident. "I wanted to personally check in again. I hope you're still enjoying your evening." Marcus returned the smile, though there was something in his eyes, an awareness of the underlying tension. "We are," he replied. "Thank you for asking." Harold hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed on. "I must admit," he continued, his tone more guarded now, "we pride ourselves on knowing our guests well. It's rare that we have visitors we aren't already familiar with. Your reservation seemed to catch us by surprise." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained intact. Marcus, too, didn't flinch. "Is that so?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral. "I wasn't aware that reservations here required prior knowledge of the guests." Harold blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the calm yet pointed response. He recovered quickly. "Of course we welcome everyone," he said, though the words felt forced. "But Limone Elegante has a reputation for catering to a specific clientele. Our regulars expect a certain atmosphere." Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And what kind of atmosphere would that be, Mr. Thompson?" Harold felt a flicker of frustration. The couple wasn't taking the bait. They weren't reacting the way he expected, and it was making him more unsettled by the second. "Well," Harold said, carefully choosing his words, "we aim to create an environment of exclusivity, a refined space for our regular patrons, those who value discretion and a particular standard of experience." There it was, his thinly veiled reminder that Marcus and Olivia didn't fit in, that they weren't part of the select group he had built his restaurant around. It was a tactic he had used before, one that usually worked to make people uncomfortable, to remind them that they didn't belong. But Marcus only smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made Harold's skin crawl. "I see," Marcus said, his voice calm and measured. "It sounds like a wonderful place for people to enjoy a special evening." Olivia chimed in then, her voice as composed as ever. "Which is exactly why we chose to come here tonight. It's our wedding anniversary." Harold felt the ground shift beneath him. He hadn't expected that. His attempts to push them out, to make them feel unwelcome, now seemed even more offensive, knowing they were here for such a personal and important occasion. A surge of discomfort washed over him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Well," Harold said, forcing another smile, "I hope your anniversary is everything you hoped for." He lingered for a moment, waiting for a crack in their composure, but Marcus and Olivia remained steady, their eyes locked on his. They weren't backing down, and Harold knew it. As he turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped him. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, his tone polite but with a sharpness that cut through the air. "People often show you who they are, one way or another." Harold froze for a moment, his back still turned. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. But he didn't turn around. Instead, he walked away, his mind spinning with a mixture of anger and something else, something he wasn't ready to confront just yet. As he returned to his station at the entrance, Harold felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. This wasn't going the way he had planned. For the first time, Harold began to realize that he wasn't just fighting against Marcus and Olivia's presence in his restaurant. He was fighting against his own sense of control slipping away. Harold returned to his station at the entrance, but his composure was beginning to crack. Marcus's parting words echoed in his mind. "People often show you who they are, one way or another." There was something unsettling about the way Marcus had said it, calm, polite, but with an undeniable edge. It felt less like a comment and more like a warning. Harold tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the rest of the evening's guests. The dining room was still filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware against fine china, and the occasional polite laughter. To anyone else, it would seem like an ordinary evening at Limone Elegante, but to Harold, the entire night felt off. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus and Olivia sitting at their table, enjoying their anniversary while subtly defying everything he had built his restaurant to represent. He glanced over at them once more, his irritation rising again as he watched them lean in close, sharing a private conversation and laughing quietly together. Despite all his efforts, the delayed service, the less desirable table placement, the thinly veiled insinuations, they remained undisturbed, as though nothing Harold had done had any effect on them. The rest of the guests barely noticed the couple anymore. They had glanced over earlier, as if trying to assess why Marcus and Olivia didn't quite fit. But now their attention had returned to their own affairs. That, too, frustrated Harold. Normally, when someone didn't fit into the scene at Limone Elegante, it created a ripple effect, a sense of disquiet among the other patrons. But tonight, the calm acceptance of the couple had somehow diffused that tension. Harold's grip on the podium in front of him tightened as a sudden, irrational anger took hold. He wasn't going to let this go, not when Marcus and Olivia were defying everything he stood for. He needed to do something more, something that would force them to acknowledge that they didn't belong, that they weren't welcome here. With renewed determination, Harold strode across the dining room once more, each step filled with purpose. This time he wasn't going to be subtle. He had tried the quiet, polite approach, and it had failed. Now, he was prepared to be more direct. As he reached their table, Marcus and Olivia looked up once again, their expressions calm but watchful. Harold could sense that they were expecting something. For the first time all night, he felt a flicker of hesitation, but his pride pushed him forward. "I'm afraid there's been a mistake," Harold said, his voice low but firm. "We've had a review of your reservation, and it seems there was an error in the system. We don't have space for you tonight after all." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, and Marcus's expression shifted, just enough for Harold to notice. He had expected anger or indignation, but instead, what he saw was disappointment. It wasn't a reaction Harold had anticipated, and it unnerved him. "An error in the system?" Marcus repeated, his tone calm but laced with skepticism. Harold nodded stiffly. "Yes, I'm afraid so. We can, of course, arrange for your meal to be prepared to go, but we need to free up this table for another party that had previously reserved it." Olivia exchanged a glance with Marcus, and for a moment Harold thought they might argue. But when Marcus spoke, his voice was steady, almost resigned. "No need for that," he said quietly. "We'll leave." Harold felt a brief surge of satisfaction. Finally, they were going to leave. But that feeling was short-lived, replaced by a sense of discomfort as he watched them rise from their seats. There was no scene, no outburst. Instead, Marcus stood with dignity, extending a hand to Olivia as she gathered her things. Before they left, Marcus turned back to Harold. His voice was calm, almost too calm as he spoke. "We won't trouble you any further, Mr. Thompson. But remember what I said earlier. People always show you who they are, one way or another." Harold felt a chill run through him, but he refused to let it show. He stood his ground, his expression carefully controlled, as Marcus and Olivia walked out of the restaurant, their heads held high. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and just like that, they were gone. The dining room returned to its usual rhythm, but to Harold something had shifted. The satisfaction he had expected to feel never came. Instead, there was a hollow pit in his stomach, a feeling of unease he couldn't shake. For a moment, he considered what Marcus had said, but he quickly brushed the thought aside. He had done what needed to be done. He had protected the image of Limone Elegante, maintained the exclusivity that had made it so successful. That was all that mattered. Or so he tried to convince himself. The following morning, Harold tried to push the previous night from his mind, but a lingering sense of unease clung to him. He told himself it was just another evening at Limone Elegante, a small disruption he had dealt with effectively. The restaurant's exclusivity had been preserved, and that was the most important thing. Still, Marcus's words echoed in his mind, as if they carried a weight he wasn't ready to face. Just as Harold settled into his office to go over the day's paperwork, his assistant, Charles, knocked softly on the door before stepping in. He held a sleek envelope in his hand, the kind Harold had come to associate with important clients or major business deals. "This came for you, Mr. Thompson," Charles said, setting the envelope on the desk. "It's marked urgent." Harold glanced at the envelope, noting the logo of a prestigious law firm embossed in gold in the corner. The name was familiar: Mitchell, Stevens & Company, a firm known for handling high-profile clients and substantial financial transactions. Harold's curiosity piqued as he picked up the envelope and opened it, unfolding the letter inside. The words were formal, precise, but the message was unmistakable. "Dear Mr. Thompson, we represent a private client who has expressed significant interest in acquiring Limone Elegante. Our client, a prominent investor with considerable experience in the hospitality industry, believes your establishment would be a valuable addition to their portfolio. Due to the sensitive nature of the transaction, our client has requested a private meeting to discuss the potential sale of Limone Elegante. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange a time that suits your schedule. We are confident that you will find our client's offer both competitive and in your best interest. Sincerely, Andrew H. Mitchell, Esquire Mitchell, Stevens & Company." Harold read the letter twice, his pulse quickening with each pass. An offer to buy Limone Elegante. He hadn't considered selling before, at least not seriously. The restaurant was his life's work, his legacy. But the idea of a substantial financial gain intrigued him, especially if it came from a serious investor. The letter didn't mention the identity of the buyer, which was common enough in high-stakes deals. Harold assumed it was someone wealthy, perhaps another restaurant owner or a large investment group looking to expand into fine dining. His mind raced with possibilities. Selling could mean walking away from the daily grind, from the pressure of maintaining Limone Elegante's reputation. He could retire in comfort, travel, perhaps even open another venture, something new, something on his terms. The idea was enticing. Harold picked up the phone and called the number listed in the letter. He wasn't one to let opportunities pass by. Within minutes, he had arranged a meeting for the next day with the law firm to discuss the offer. As he hung up the phone, a sense of anticipation buzzed inside him. It could be the deal of a lifetime, he thought. Yet, beneath the excitement, there was a flicker of something else, an uneasy feeling, as if the events of the previous night were somehow tied to this sudden offer. He brushed the thought aside. The world of high-end restaurants was full of powerful people looking to invest in successful ventures. This was simply a business opportunity, nothing more. Still, the hollow pit in his stomach lingered. The next day, Harold arrived at the offices of Mitchell, Stevens & Company. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and polished stone, exuding the kind of power and wealth that came with representing high-profile clients. Harold had been to similar offices many times before, but today, something felt different. As he was escorted into the conference room, Harold felt a small thrill of excitement. This could be the beginning of something new, an opportunity to cash out while Limone Elegante was still at its peak. The idea of walking away with a sizable fortune held undeniable appeal. The door to the conference room opened, and Harold stood, expecting to meet a senior partner, or perhaps a representative of the mystery investor. Instead, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Standing before him, impeccably dressed and with calm expressions, were Marcus and Olivia Daniels. For a moment, Harold's mind refused to process what he was seeing. The couple from the night before, the ones he had tried to push out of his restaurant, were standing in front of him, poised and confident. But now, they weren't guests. They were his potential buyers. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said smoothly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Harold stood frozen, his hands suspended in the air for a moment before he grasped Marcus's. His grip was firm, but his mind was spinning. Them. Marcus and Olivia were the investors interested in buying Limone Elegante? As Olivia stepped forward to shake his hand, Harold finally found his voice. I wasn't expecting to see you here, Olivia smiled politely. I imagine not, she replied. But we believe this will be a productive conversation. Harold swallowed hard, his heart racing. This was not the meeting he had envisioned. He had come expecting to negotiate a business deal with a faceless investor, not the very couple he had tried to dismiss from his restaurant. Marcus gestured to the chairs. Shall we sit? We have much to discuss. Still reeling from the shock, Harold nodded and took his seat at the table. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. He had to maintain control, even as the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. As Marcus and Olivia sat down across from him, Harold felt the unsettling realization that he was no longer in control of this situation. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure how this was going to end. Harold sat stiffly across from Marcus and Olivia Daniels, his mind still reeling from the shock. This wasn't how things were supposed to unfold. The previous night he had made it clear that they didn't belong at Limone Elegante. And now, they were sitting across from him as potential buyers, poised and confident, in complete control of the situation. Marcus's calm, composed demeanor only deepened Harold's unease. He had expected an investor with money, but not one with such a personal stake in the matter. Olivia, seated beside Marcus, remained quiet, her eyes steady, as if she knew something Harold didn't. The door opened again, and a few representatives from Mitchell, Stevens and Company entered, briefcases in hand. They took their seats on either side of Marcus and Olivia, laying out documents and making the introductions. Harold tried to maintain his composure, but the tension in his chest grew tighter with every passing second. Thank you for meeting with us, Mr. Thompson, Marcus began, his voice steady and professional. As you may have gathered, my wife and I are interested in acquiring Limone Elegante. We believe it's a unique establishment with significant potential. Harold's throat felt tight, but he managed a stiff nod. Yes, I see. You're in the hospitality industry then? Marcus smiled faintly. You could say that. We've built a portfolio of successful restaurants over the years. Limone Elegante fits well within our vision for the future. Harold blinked. This wasn't just some casual investment. Marcus and Olivia weren't outsiders to the industry. They were seasoned players. The realization left him feeling even more off balance. How could he have misjudged them so completely? He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. Limone Elegante is a very exclusive restaurant. I've worked hard to build its reputation, its clientele. It's not just any dining establishment. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. And that's exactly why we're interested. It has a reputation for excellence, and we believe we can preserve that, while also expanding its reach. Harold frowned. Expanding its reach? Olivia spoke for the first time, her voice calm but firm. Yes, Mr. Thompson. We believe that Limone Elegante could benefit from broadening its appeal. Fine dining shouldn't be restricted to a certain type of clientele. There's an opportunity to create a more inclusive environment while maintaining the elegance and quality you've built. Harold felt his stomach turn. He had spent years crafting Limone Elegante into an exclusive space, one that catered to a very specific crowd. The idea of expanding its reach, of making it more inclusive, went against everything he had built. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Olivia met his gaze steadily. By bringing in a more diverse clientele, by ensuring that everyone who appreciates fine dining feels welcome, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Harold's mind raced. This was the opposite of everything he had worked for. The exclusivity, the control, it would all be undone. He could feel his grasp slipping, his carefully constructed world falling apart. That's not the vision I had for the restaurant. Marcus smiled faintly. We understand that, Mr. Thompson. But times change. The world is changing. Limone Elegante can thrive under a new model, one that embraces diversity and inclusion without sacrificing quality. Harold felt a surge of panic, but he couldn't let it show. He had come to this meeting expecting to be in control, to dictate the terms of the sale. But now it was clear that Marcus and Olivia had the upper hand. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "We're prepared to make a generous offer, one that we believe you'll find more than satisfactory. But there are conditions." Harold's chest tightened. "Conditions?" "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "The first condition is that the sale happens quickly. We want to finalize the transaction within a week." Harold blinked, surprised by the speed of their demand. "A week?" "We're ready to move forward," Olivia added, her tone sharp. "Our legal team has already prepared the necessary paperwork. All we need is your agreement." Harold swallowed hard. He had expected negotiations, but nothing this fast or decisive. "And the other conditions?" Marcus's eyes locked onto Harold's. "You must step away completely. Once the sale is finalized, you'll have no further involvement with the restaurant. No public statements, no lingering influence. You'll leave quietly and allow us to take over." Harold's stomach twisted. The idea of walking away from Limone Elegante, of disappearing without any acknowledgement or control, was unthinkable. "You want me to just leave?" "Yes," Olivia said firmly. "And there's one more condition. You agree never to open a competing establishment. We'll include a non-compete clause in the contract. If you try to open a similar restaurant, we'll take legal action." Harold felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't a business deal, it was a takeover. They were stripping him of everything, his control, his legacy, his identity. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the gravity of the situation settled in. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. "We're offering you a way out, Mr. Thompson. A very profitable way out. But it comes with the understanding that you'll step aside completely." Harold's mind raced. He could refuse, could walk away from the deal. But then what? If word got out about the way he had treated Marcus and Olivia the night before, his reputation would be ruined. Investors would pull out, patrons would disappear, and Limone Elegante would crumble. It would. His only other option was to take the deal, to accept their terms and walk away with his fortune intact, but without the pride and legacy he had spent his life building. For a long moment, the room was silent. Harold stared at the documents on the table, his hands trembling slightly. He had never felt so powerless. "I'll consider the offer," Harold finally said, his voice hollow. Marcus and Olivia exchanged a glance, then stood. Marcus extended his hand once again. "Take your time, Mr. Thompson. But I think you'll find this is the best option for everyone involved." Harold shook his hand, his movements stiff and mechanical. He watched as Marcus and Olivia gathered their things, preparing to leave the room. Just before they walked out, Olivia turned back to him. "Remember what Marcus said," she said quietly. "People always show you who they are." With that, they left, leaving Harold alone in the conference room, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like never before. Harold sat in the empty conference room for what felt like an eternity after Marcus and Olivia left. The sleek, polished table in front of him reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, but it felt cold and distant, much like the thoughts running through his mind. He had come to this meeting expecting a lucrative business deal, perhaps a chance to walk away from the restaurant on his own terms, with his legacy intact. But now, the reality was far different. Marcus and Olivia weren't just investors. They were taking over everything. The conditions they had laid out were brutal. He would have no say in how his restaurant was run, no influence on its future. And worst of all, he would be forced to disappear quietly, with no recognition for what he had built. Harold's hands shook slightly as he stared at the documents the lawyers had left behind. The numbers were substantial, more money than Harold had ever imagined, enough to secure his future in luxury. But the thought of taking the money and walking away felt like an admission of failure. He had spent years building Limone Elegante, shaping it into an exclusive sanctuary for the wealthy and elite. To have it taken from him now by a couple he had tried to dismiss felt like the ultimate humiliation. He thought about Marcus's words, "People always show you who they are." Harold had been so sure of who he was, so certain of his place in the world. But now, as he sat alone in the sterile conference room, he wasn't so sure anymore. As the hours passed, Harold's mind spun with possibilities, but none of them seemed to offer him what he truly wanted. He could refuse the offer, but the damage was already done. Marcus and Olivia held all the cards now. They could easily expose the way Harold had treated them, and in today's world, a scandal like that would destroy his reputation. The exclusive clientele he had cultivated so carefully would abandon him in a heartbeat, and the restaurant would be left in ruins. On the other hand, taking the deal meant walking away with his fortune intact, but without the pride, the control, or the legacy he had spent his life building. It was an impossible choice, and Harold wasn't sure he had the strength to make it. By the time Harold left the conference room, his decision weighed heavily on him. He returned to Limone Elegante that evening, the restaurant bustling with its usual crowd of elegant diners. Everything appeared as it always had. The perfectly set tables, the soft glow of the chandeliers, the quiet hum of conversation. But to Harold it all felt hollow. The restaurant that had once been his pride and joy now felt like a burden, a reminder of everything he was about to lose. That night Harold barely slept. His mind was a storm of emotions, anger, resentment, regret. He thought about Marcus and Olivia, about how he had tried to push them out of his restaurant, about how they had turned the tables on him so completely. The powerlessness he felt was suffocating. The next morning, Harold sat in his office at Limone Elegante, staring blankly at the papers on his desk. The decision he had to make was clear: either accept Marcus and Olivia's offer or watch everything he had built crumble around him. His fingers trembled as he picked up the phone. It rang twice before Andrew Mitchell, the lawyer handling the deal, answered. "Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said, his voice calm and professional, "have you made a decision?" Harold's throat felt dry. "I'll accept the offer," he said quietly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. He felt as though he had just signed away his soul. Mitchell didn't miss a beat. "Excellent. We'll move forward with the paperwork immediately. The transaction will be finalized by the end of the week." Harold nodded, though the lawyer couldn't see him. "Thank you." When he hung up the phone, Harold sat in silence for a long time. The deal was done. He had sold Limone Elegante. It was no longer his. For the rest of the week, Harold went through the motions of running the restaurant, though his heart was no longer in it. He greeted patrons, oversaw the staff, and ensured everything appeared as it should. But inside, he felt a deep emptiness. The knowledge that this was his final week at the helm of Limone Elegante weighed on him with every passing day. As the day of the sale approached, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed. He had built something beautiful, something that reflected his vision of success, and now it was being taken from him, not just by anyone, but by people he had underestimated and tried to exclude. The irony was painful. On the final evening before the sale was to be completed, Harold stayed late at the restaurant. The dining room was quiet, the last of the guests having left for the night. He walked through the empty space, taking in the details, the crystal chandeliers, the elegant table settings, the art on the walls. Everything was as perfect as it had always been, but to Harold, it no longer felt like his. He sat at one of the corner tables, staring out into the empty room, his mind swirling with thoughts. This was it, the end of an era. The restaurant that had defined his life was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he sat there in the silence, Harold thought back to Marcus's words once more. People always show you who they are. Harold had thought he was in control, that he could dictate who belonged and who didn't. But in the end, Marcus and Olivia had shown him something he hadn't wanted to see, his own arrogance, his own blindness. The next morning, the sale was finalized. Marcus and Olivia Daniels became the new owners of Limone Elegante, and Harold Thompson walked away with his fortune intact, but his pride in tatters. The day after the sale of Limone Elegante was finalized, Harold woke up with a strange sense of detachment. He had always imagined that if he ever sold the restaurant, it would be on his own terms, a moment of triumph, where he would be celebrated for his success, leaving with his head held high. But now, as he sat in his quiet apartment, the reality of his situation felt far different. There was no celebration, no grand farewell, just the quiet, empty realization that it was over. He had walked away from Limone Elegante, his life's work, with a bank account full of money but nothing that resembled the pride or satisfaction he had once envisioned. He spent the morning going through the paperwork that had arrived from the law firm, the final formalities of the sale. Each page felt like a reminder of what he had lost, not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of control, identity, and purpose. He had sold everything, his legacy, his vision, for a future that now felt uncertain and hollow. Harold's phone rang, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was the maître d' from Limone Elegante, a man who had been with him for years and understood the intricate details of running the restaurant just as well as Harold did. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," the maître d' began, his voice respectful but uncertain. "I just wanted to let you know that everything is in place for the transition. Marcus and Olivia Daniels have been very clear about the changes they plan to make and, well, it seems like they're moving quickly." Harold's chest tightened. "Changes?" he asked, though he already knew what was coming. "Yes, sir. They're planning to remodel the dining room and adjust the menu to be more inclusive. They've spoken to the staff and made it clear that Limone Elegante will be moving in a different direction under their ownership." Harold closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the words. He had known this was coming. He had known that Marcus and Olivia intended to make the restaurant their own, to reshape it according to their vision. But hearing it now, so soon after the sale, made the loss feel even more real. "Thank you for letting me know," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. He hung up the phone, the reality settling over him like a heavy blanket. The restaurant he had built from the ground up, the one he had controlled so meticulously, was about to become something entirely different, something that no longer reflected his vision. Later that afternoon, Harold found himself standing outside Limone Elegante. He hadn't planned on going there, but something had pulled him back to the place that had been his life for so many years. The building looked the same from the outside, sleek, elegant, a symbol of success. But Harold knew that everything inside was changing. Through the glass windows he could see the staff bustling about, preparing for the evening service. And there, at the center of it all, were Marcus and Olivia. They moved through the dining room with ease, speaking to the staff with the same calm authority that had so unnerved Harold the first time he had met them. They were in control now. Harold watched as Marcus spoke to one of the chefs, gesturing toward the kitchen with a confident smile. Olivia stood nearby, reviewing something on a tablet, her demeanor poised and professional. They looked comfortable, as if they had always belonged in this space. For a moment, Harold felt a surge of bitterness rise up in him. This was his restaurant, his creation. He had spent years shaping it, making it what it was. And now, these people he had tried to push out, were the ones running it. But as he stood there watching Marcus and Olivia work, the bitterness gave way to something else, something quieter and more painful. The truth. He had lost not because Marcus and Olivia had taken something from him, but because he had never truly understood what Limone Elegante could be. He had built it as a fortress, a place to exclude rather than to welcome. And now, under new ownership, it was becoming something more, something Harold had never allowed it to be. As he stood outside the restaurant, watching through the glass, Harold realized that Marcus and Olivia were doing what he had been too proud to do. They were opening the doors to more people, inviting in a broader clientele, creating an atmosphere of inclusivity without sacrificing quality, and the restaurant would thrive because of it. Harold turned away from the window, feeling the weight of his own limitations press down on him. He had spent so many years believing that success meant control. Control over who was allowed in, control over the image of the restaurant, control over the people around him. But now, he could see how that control had become a cage, trapping him in a narrow view of the world. For the first time in his life, Harold understood what Marcus had meant. People always show you who they are. Harold had shown the world exactly who he was, proud, rigid, unwilling to change, and in the end, it had cost him everything. As he walked away from Limone Elegante, Harold knew that he couldn't go back. The restaurant would move on without him, and it would thrive under Marcus and Olivia's leadership. They had shown him that there was a different way to succeed, one that didn't rely on exclusion and control. But for Harold, it was too late to be part of that future. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. The days following Harold's quiet departure from Limone Elegante were filled with a silence that weighed heavily on him. For the first time in years, his life was no longer dictated by the rhythm of running the restaurant. There were no guests to greet, no staff to manage, no details to perfect. It was just Harold, alone with his thoughts. He had thought that the payout from the sale would bring him comfort, maybe even some satisfaction in knowing that, at the very least, he had secured his financial future. But as the days passed, the wealth in his bank account felt meaningless. Without Limone Elegante, without the sense of control and purpose it had given him, Harold felt adrift. The pride that had once fueled him, that had driven him to build his restaurant into a symbol of exclusivity and success, now felt like a burden he couldn't shake. Everywhere he went, he saw reminders of what he had lost. Not just the restaurant, but the sense of identity that had been tied to it. Harold began avoiding the parts of the city where he might run into people who knew him as the owner of Limone Elegante. The thought of having to explain why he had sold the restaurant, why he was no longer involved, was too much for him to bear. Instead, he withdrew, spending most of his time alone in his apartment, trying to figure out what his life would look like now. One afternoon, Harold decided to take a walk through a park near his home, hoping that some fresh air might clear his mind. As he strolled through the winding paths, he passed by a small cafe. It was a modest place, nothing like the grandeur of Limone Elegante, but there was something inviting about it. The people inside were laughing, talking, enjoying their meals without the weight of exclusivity hanging over them. For a moment, Harold felt a pang of longing, an ache for something simpler, something he had never allowed himself to create. He had spent so many years building walls around his restaurant, keeping it closed off to all but a select few. And now, looking through the window of the cafe, he saw the kind of warmth and openness that had always been missing from Limone Elegante. It was in that moment, standing outside the cafe, that Harold began to understand something he had never fully grasped before. He had built Limone Elegante not to create a space of elegance and fine dining, but to protect his own sense of superiority. He had used exclusivity as a way to keep people out, to maintain control over who was allowed into his world. And in doing so, he had isolated himself, both from the people around him and from the possibilities of what the restaurant could have been. Harold turned away from the cafe, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He continued his walk, but his thoughts remained focused on what he had learned about himself in recent days. Marcus and Olivia hadn't just taken his restaurant. They had shown him the flaws in his thinking, the narrowness of his vision. They had demonstrated that success didn't have to come at the cost of exclusion and control. For the first time, Harold allowed himself to reflect on the decisions he had made, not just in selling the restaurant, but in how he had run it for so many years. He thought about the people he had subtly turned away, the unspoken rules he had enforced to keep certain types of guests out. He had convinced himself that it was necessary to preserve the restaurant's reputation, but now he saw it for what it was: pride, arrogance, and fear of change. He wondered what Limone Elegante would look like now, under Marcus and Olivia's leadership. He had seen glimpses of the changes they were making, the way they were opening the doors to a wider range of people, making the restaurant more welcoming while still maintaining its elegance. And as much as it pained Harold to admit it, he knew that the restaurant would thrive because of those changes. The realization was bittersweet. On the one hand, It confirmed what he had feared, that the restaurant could succeed without him, that his vision wasn't the only path to success. On the other hand, it gave him a strange sense of peace. Maybe it was for the best that Limone Elegante was no longer his. Maybe it had always needed something he wasn't capable of giving. As the days passed, Harold's reflections became more frequent, and with them came a growing sense of acceptance. He had made mistakes, and those mistakes had cost him dearly. But there was no point in dwelling on the past. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could try to learn from it. Harold wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never again build something out of pride and exclusion. He had seen the consequences of that path, and he had no desire to repeat them. For now, though, he was left with the quiet reality of his own reflection. A man who had spent years believing that success came from control and exclusivity, only to learn that true success came from openness and inclusion. And in that lesson, there was a small flicker of hope. In the weeks that followed, Harold's life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. Without the constant demands of running a high-end restaurant, he found himself with more time than he knew what to do with. At first, the emptiness gnawed at him, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. But gradually he started to appreciate the quiet, the chance to reflect without the pressure of maintaining appearances or managing a business. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, Harold found himself once again passing by Limone Elegante. He hesitated outside the familiar facade, his heart heavy with the memories of the restaurant's past and the knowledge of how much it had changed. The windows gleamed as they always had, but something inside felt different, more alive, more open. Through the glass, Harold could see patrons seated at tables, laughing, talking, and enjoying their meals. The once rigidly exclusive atmosphere had shifted. It was still elegant, still refined, but there was a warmth now that had never been present during his ownership. Marcus and Olivia had succeeded in transforming Limone Elegante into a place that welcomed all who appreciated fine dining, regardless of their background or status. As Harold stood there watching through the window, he felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, regret, and a quiet sense of understanding. He hadn't thought it possible, but the restaurant was thriving in ways he had never imagined. Marcus and Olivia had taken something that Harold had built and made it better, and for the first time, Harold could acknowledge that without bitterness. He turned away from the window and continued down the street, his steps slow and deliberate. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Harold felt a glimmer of hope. He had spent so much of his life trapped in a cycle of control, afraid of letting go, afraid of change. But now he could see that change was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. A few days later, Harold sat in a small cafe, much like the one he had passed weeks before. It wasn't fancy or exclusive, but it was comfortable, and the atmosphere was welcoming. As he sipped his coffee, Harold thought about what the future might look like for him. He wasn't sure if he wanted to get back into the restaurant business, but if he did, it would be different. He had learned too much to go back to the way things were. If he opened another establishment, it wouldn't be built on exclusion or control. It would be a place that welcomed people, that embraced diversity and community, something he had never allowed himself to do at Limone Elegante. He knew that it wouldn't erase the mistakes he had made in the past, but it would be a step towards something better, something more meaningful. As Harold sat there, lost in thought, a realization washed over him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about the past or what he had lost. He was thinking about the future, and that, in itself, was progress. The lesson Marcus and Olivia had taught him, whether they had intended to or not, had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He saw now that real success wasn't about controlling who walked through the doors of your restaurant or building walls to keep people out. It was about creating a space where people could come together, share experiences, and feel like they belonged. Harold wasn't sure what the next chapter of his life would hold, but he knew one thing. He was ready to move forward. He had been shown who he truly was, and now he had a chance to change that. With that thought, Harold stood, paid for his coffee, and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The future stretched before him, uncertain but full of possibility, and for the first time in years, Harold welcomed it. If this story gripped you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you captivating new stories every day. Stay tuned for more.